Medieval Europeans bathed more than you think. They had elaborate theories about cleanliness, sophisticated bathing rituals, and detailed medical advice about washing. They cared about hygiene obsessively, and it killed them, because almost everything they believed about how dirt, disease, and the human body worked was catastrophically, lethally wrong. Their mistakes killed more people than any war, any famine, any plague that did not arrive on the back of those very misunderstandings. This is not the simple story of filth you have been told. Ignorant people caked in dirt who never washed and thought nothing of it. The reality was far stranger and far more disturbing. Medieval people were not dying because they did not care. They were dying because they cared in exactly the wrong ways. So what was hygiene really like in medieval Europe? The answer is a story of people trying desperately to stay clean and healthy, and failing in ways they could never have understood. To make sense of medieval hygiene, you need to understand the world these people inhabited, because their approach to cleanliness was not arbitrary. It was logical, built on a framework of knowledge that happened to be almost entirely incorrect. We are somewhere in Western Europe, let us say between the 12th and 15th centuries, the period most people mean when they say the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire, which had built the most sophisticated public sanitation system the world would see for another 1,500 years, has been gone for 7 centuries. The great aqueducts that once carried millions of gallons of fresh water into cities like Rome, Londinium, and Lutetia are crumbling or already collapsed. The elaborate public baths, the thermae, where Romans of every class gathered daily to wash, exercise, socialize, and conduct business, have been abandoned, repurposed as churches, or quarried for building stone. The engineered sewers that carried waste out of Roman cities have silted up and been forgotten. What replaced this infrastructure wasn't nothing, but it was vastly more primitive and vastly less effective. The intellectual framework governing medieval hygiene came from 2 sources, and understanding them is essential. The first was ancient Greek medicine, particularly the theory of the 4 humours, transmitted to medieval Europe through the writings of Galen and, via Arabic translations and commentaries, the great physician Avicenna. This theory held that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on keeping these fluids in proper balance. Disease occurred when the humours fell out of equilibrium, and the causes of imbalance included diet, emotion, season, climate, and critically exposure to corrupted air. This last concept, miasma theory, was the single most important and most destructive idea in medieval hygiene. Bad smells were not merely unpleasant. They were believed to be genuinely, physically dangerous, capable of entering the body through the nose and mouth, disrupting the humoral balance and causing illness or death. The second source was the Church, which introduced a moral dimension to bodily care that the pagan Romans would have found baffling. The body, in Christian theology, was a vessel for the soul, necessary but suspect, always threatening to lead the spirit into sin through its appetites and desires. Excessive attention to the body, particularly its pleasures, was spiritually dangerous. This did not mean the Church opposed all washing. That is another myth. But it did mean that the relationship between a medieval person and their own body was charged with moral anxiety in a way that had no parallel in the ancient world. Now, let us talk about the physical reality of hygiene, the spaces where medieval people actually confronted dirt, water, and their own bodies. And perhaps the best place to begin is the one that surprises most modern people: the bathhouse. Medieval Europe had bathhouses. Quite a lot of them, in fact. By the 13th century, most towns of any size had at least one public bathhouse, and major cities had dozens. Paris in the year 1292 had at least 26 registered bathhouse keepers, organized into their own guild, with regulations governing their hours of operation and the prices they could charge. London had a famous concentration of bathhouses called stews along the south bank of the Thames in Southwark, and similar establishments existed in Bruges, Cologne, Nuremberg, Florence, and virtually every other significant urban centre. These were not crude facilities. The larger ones featured heated pools, steam rooms, individual wooden tubs filled with hot water, and attendants who would scrub your back, trim your hair, and shave your beard. Some offered food and drink. Many offered considerably more than that, which is precisely why the story of medieval bathhouses does not end with cleanliness. The bathhouses became, over time, synonymous with sex. The association between bathing, nakedness, and prostitution was so strong that the English word stew, which originally meant a heated bathhouse, gradually shifted in meaning until it simply meant a brothel. Church authorities and civic officials railed against the bathhouses with increasing fury throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, issuing regulations, imposing fines, and occasionally shutting them down entirely. Not because they objected to washing, but because the bathhouses had become centres of behaviour they considered sinful and socially dangerous. The Council of Basel in 1431 is recorded as having caused a significant increase in bathhouse traffic, as visiting clergy, hundreds of them, made enthusiastic use of the local facilities in ways that had little to do with hygiene. But the real death blow to public bathing came not from moral outrage, but from disease. When syphilis arrived in Europe in the 1490s, spreading with terrifying speed through exactly the kinds of intimate contact that bathhouses facilitated, and when recurring waves of plague made any gathering of naked, sweating bodies in an enclosed space seem like an invitation to death, the bathhouses closed. Not all at once, but steadily, decisively, over the course of the 16th century. And when they closed, nothing replaced them. Europe would not recover a culture of regular public bathing for nearly 300 years. But what about private bathing? Washing at home, in a castle, in a monastery? This is where the picture becomes genuinely complicated. Medieval people did bathe privately, more often than the popular myth suggests, but the logistics of doing so were so demanding that it could never be casual or frequent. Heating enough water for a full bath required an enormous expenditure of fuel, wood or charcoal, and labour. Servants had to haul water from a well, heat it over fires, and carry it in heavy buckets to wherever the tub was placed. A single bath for one person might require 20 or 30 gallons of heated water. For a noble household, this was manageable but expensive and time-consuming. For a peasant family with one hearth and a single iron pot, it was a significant undertaking reserved for special occasions. The tub itself was typically a large barrel or a purpose-built wooden vat, sometimes lined with linen cloth to prevent splinters. The bather sat in the tub, often with a canopy or tent of fabric draped over it to trap the steam and warmth. Soap existed. It was made from animal fat and wood ash, and by the later medieval period, finer soaps were being imported from Spain, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. But it was not cheap, and its quality varied enormously. A wealthy household might use scented Castile soap made with olive oil. A poor one might use a harsh lye soap that could strip skin raw. If bathing was the aspirational side of medieval hygiene, the garderobe was its unflinching opposite. The garderobe, the medieval toilet, was a small stone chamber built into the thickness of a castle wall, projecting outward on corbels so that waste fell down the exterior face into the moat or a cesspit below. The seat was a slab of stone with a hole cut through it, worn smooth by generations of use. There was no door. A curtain, or more, often just an angled entry passage, provided the barest suggestion of privacy. The draft that rose continuously through the opening was fierce enough to stir your clothing, and it carried with it a smell that permeated the surrounding corridors. A thick, permanent, ammonia-laden stench that no amount of herb strewing could mask. The word garderobe literally means guardrobe, because people stored clothing near the latrine in the belief that the fumes would kill moths and fleas. This actually worked to some degree, which tells you everything about the intensity of those fumes. In towns and cities, the situation was worse. Ordinary houses had no garderobes. They had chamber pots, ceramic or wooden vessels kept under the bed or in a corner that were emptied each morning into the street gutter, or, if you were fortunate, into a communal cesspit shared by the entire block. These cesspits were supposed to be cleaned periodically by men called gong farmers. Gong being an old English word for a privy, who worked exclusively at night because the smell was considered too offensive for daylight hours. Gong farmers were among the lowest paid and most despised workers in medieval society, and also among the most essential. The cesspits they cleaned could be 10 or 15 feet deep, and the work was done by hand in darkness with shovels and buckets. A coroner's record from London in 1326 describes a man named Richard the Raker who fell through the rotted boards covering his own cesspit and suffocated in the waste below. The record notes this with the clinical brevity that medieval legal documents reserve for the routine disasters of daily life. The frequency of bathing is one of the most debated questions in medieval social history, and the honest answer is that it varied enormously by class, region, period, and individual preference. Medical texts from the period frequently recommended bathing. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the most influential medical text in medieval Europe, contains detailed instructions on bathing, including optimal water temperatures for different constitutions and seasons. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a widely circulated health manual from the medical school at Salerno, advised regular washing and warned against allowing dirt to accumulate on the skin. Account rolls from noble households record purchases of bathing supplies, tubs, towels, soap, herbs for scenting the water, with enough regularity to suggest that the wealthy bathed at least weekly. The English King John, in the early 13th century, is recorded as having bathed roughly once every 3 weeks, which his contemporaries apparently considered reasonable for a man of his station. But these were the privileged. For the vast majority of people, the peasants, labourers, and urban poor, who made up perhaps 90% of the population, a full immersion bath was a rare event, perhaps monthly, perhaps seasonal, perhaps occurring only at the great turning points of life: birth, marriage, serious illness, and preparation for death. What people did far more frequently than bathing was spot washing, cleaning the hands, face, and sometimes the feet with water and a cloth. This was not merely a private habit, but a social ritual with real significance. Before every meal in a noble or wealthy household, servants brought a basin of warm water, a pitcher called an aqua manile, sometimes shaped like a lion, a horse, or a knight on horseback. These were considered fine objects of craftsmanship, and a clean linen towel. The diners washed their hands while the water was poured over them, and this was not optional. Eating without washing your hands was considered not just unclean, but actively rude, a violation of social codes that could mark you as ill-bred or worse. Table manners in the medieval period were codified in extraordinary detail in books called courtesy texts, and the insistence on hand washing before meals appears in virtually all of them. "Wash your hands when you rise from bed," instructs one 13th century courtesy text. "Wash your hands before dinner. Wash your hands after dinner. And do not put your fingers into your ears, your nose, or your eyes." This was civilization. This was the expected standard. But it only extended to the visible surfaces of the body. What lay beneath the clothing was another matter entirely. And this is where we arrive at the truly alien territory of medieval hygiene, the parts of daily life that most people today would find genuinely difficult to bear. Let us begin with what you wore against your skin and how rarely it was cleaned. Clothing in the medieval period was expensive, far more expensive relative to income than clothing is today. A simple linen shirt might cost a labourer several days' wages. A wool tunic could represent weeks of income. A nobleman's fur-lined robe was an investment comparable to a modern car. Clothing was mended, patched, resoled, and inherited. It was not casually discarded. And because washing fabric, particularly heavy woolen fabric, was a laborious, damaging process that shortened the garment's life, outer clothing was washed rarely, if ever. What was washed, and washed more frequently, was the undergarment that sat against the skin, the linen shirt or chemise. Linen was valued precisely because it could be washed, bleached in the sun, and dried without significant damage. Changing your linen was, for medieval people, the functional equivalent of bathing. A clean shirt against your skin was a clean body. The smell, the sweat, the accumulated grime of days or weeks, all of it was understood to be absorbed by the linen, which could then be laundered while the body beneath was considered adequately clean. If this sounds insufficient to you, consider that your definition of clean and theirs occupied entirely different universes. The process of laundering that linen was itself a brutal affair. Laundresses, and it was almost exclusively women who did this work, soaked the garments in large wooden troughs or vats filled with a solution of water and lye, the caustic alkaline liquid produced by running water through wood ash. The fabric was then pounded, beaten with wooden bats, scrubbed against stones, rinsed in running water, wrung out by hand, and spread over bushes or hedges to dry and bleach in the sun. The lye was harsh enough to crack and blister the skin of the hands, and chronic skin damage was an occupational hazard that marked laundresses as visibly as a blacksmith's burns marked a smith. In cities, laundry was done at the nearest river or at public washing places, and the water downstream from these sites was contaminated with lye, grease, and whatever the linen had absorbed from the bodies it had covered. But this contamination was invisible, and no one understood its significance. Now, let us talk about what lived on you and in your clothing, because this is the reality that separates medieval hygiene from modern experience more than any other single fact. Lice were universal, not common, universal. Every person in medieval Europe, from the king on his throne to the beggar at the church door, harbored body lice, head lice, or both. Fleas were equally pervasive, breeding in the rushes on the floor, in the straw of mattresses, in the folds of woolen clothing, in the fur of the dogs that slept in every hall and every hovel. The constant, crawling, biting presence of these parasites was so normal, so inescapable, that it barely warranted comment in contemporary sources. When it was mentioned, it was with resignation rather than horror. A 12th century monk named Jocelyn of Brakelond, describing life at the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, noted matter-of-factly that the brothers picked lice from their clothing during services. not as a sign of neglect, but as a simple fact of embodied existence. Delousing was a social activity, like grooming among primates. Mothers deloused their children. Wives deloused their husbands. Friends deloused each other. It was intimate, it was necessary, and it happened constantly because the parasites returned constantly. The parasites were only the beginning. Medieval skin was a landscape of afflictions that modern dermatology has largely eliminated. Scabies, caused by microscopic mites that burrow into the skin and lay eggs, was endemic, producing an agonizing itch that drove sufferers to scratch until they bled, creating open sores that quickly became infected. Ringworm left circular, scaly patches on the scalp and body. Impetigo, spread by touch in crowded conditions, covered the skin with crusted, weeping sores. Ergotism, caused by a fungus that contaminated ryegrain, produced horrifying symptoms, including burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, and in severe cases, gangrene that caused fingers, toes, and entire limbs to blacken and fall off. Medieval people called it Saint Anthony's fire and attributed it to divine punishment or demonic influence. The actual cause, a microscopic fungus growing on the bread they ate every day, was as invisible to them as the bacteria in their water. And then there was leprosy, the disease that carried not just physical suffering, but total social death. A person diagnosed with leprosy, and the diagnosis was often wrong, as many skin conditions were misidentified as leprous, was subjected to a ritual that amounted to a funeral for the living. The priest read the burial service. The leper was given a cloak, a bell and a pair of gloves, and was forbidden from entering churches, markets, mills, bakeries, or any gathering of healthy people. They were required to ring their bell when approaching others, announcing their contamination like a walking alarm. They could not touch children. They could not eat or drink with anyone. They were, in every meaningful social sense, already dead. Leper colonies, called lazarets, existed outside the walls of most major towns, grim communities of the excluded, surviving on. The fear of leprosy was so profound that it shaped hygiene practices, social interactions, and even architecture for centuries. But here is something most people do not realize about medieval lice. They were not merely disgusting, they were lethal. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis, are the vector for epidemic typhus, a disease caused by the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii, which lice transmit through their feces when they feed on human blood. Typhus killed tens of thousands of people throughout the medieval and early modern periods, and no one understood why. The connection between lice, their droppings, and the fevers that swept through crowded, unwashed populations was invisible to a world that blamed illness on bad air and unbalanced humors. You could not see the danger. You could only feel the itch, scratch absently, and hope the fever that took your neighbor would somehow pass you by. Your day, if you were a typical person in a medieval town around the year 1300, began with an encounter with hygiene that would set the tone for everything that followed. You woke in a bed you shared with at least one other person, your spouse, your children, or if you were a servant, your fellow servants. The bed was a wooden frame strung with rope, supporting a mattress stuffed with straw that had not been changed in weeks, possibly months. The bedding, a coarse linen sheet, a woolen blanket, carried the accumulated body heat and smell of its occupants, along with the lice and fleas that had fed during the night. You rose, and if you were conscientious about your health, you washed your face and hands in a basin of cold water. You might rinse your mouth with water, wine, or a mixture of vinegar and herbs. Dental hygiene, such as it existed, recommended rubbing the teeth with a cloth and rinsing, and some medical texts advised chewing sage leaves or using powdered salt as an abrasive. But there was no toothbrush as we know it, and there was no concept of the bacterial processes that cause tooth decay. The stone grit in bread, an unavoidable contaminant from the grinding process, wore down tooth enamel year after year, exposing the softer dentin beneath and creating pathways for infection. Archaeological analysis of medieval skulls reveals a population in dental agony, massive cavities, abscesses that had eaten through jawbone, teeth worn down to flat stumps by the age of 30. When the pain became unbearable, the only remedy was extraction, performed by a barber surgeon or a traveling tooth puller at a market fair, without anesthesia, using iron forceps and brute force. The hole left behind was packed with a wad of cloth or, in some folk remedies, sealed with a plug of beeswax. If infection set in, and it often did, the resulting sepsis could be fatal. A toothache, it was a potentially lethal condition, and the steady accumulation of dental damage over a lifetime was one of the defining physical experiences of the age. If you were a woman, your morning hygiene involved additional rituals that reveal how deeply gendered the medieval body was. Hair was a charged subject. For married women, covering the hair was a social and moral obligation. An uncovered head in public was a sign of sexual availability or outright disgrace. The wimple, the veil, the coif, these were not fashion choices, but statements of status and virtue. Beneath the covering, hair was braided tightly, pinned, and left largely unwashed for extended periods. When it was washed, the preferred method was a rinse with a mixture of wood ash water, sometimes scented with rosemary or chamomile. Combing was done with fine-tooth combs carved from bone or wood, the same combs that doubled as lice removal tools, and surviving examples pulled from archaeological digs still contain the tiny bodies of medieval lice, trapped between the teeth, preserved for 700 years. Men's grooming was somewhat simpler, but no less regimented. Beards were kept trimmed by barbers who also served as surgeons, tooth pullers, and bloodletters. The barber's pole, with its spiral of red and white, is a surviving symbol of this combination of services, the red representing blood and the white representing bandages. A visit to the barber was both a grooming appointment and a medical consultation, and the same blade that shaved your chin might, minutes later, open a vein in your arm. The smell of a medieval person was, by modern standards, overwhelming. But this requires careful qualification, because the medieval nose inhabited a different world from yours. People who have never known deodorant, daily showers, or laundered clothing do not smell their own baseline odor any more than you smell the synthetic fragrances that saturate your own environment. What medieval people did smell, and what they feared, was deviation from the norm. An unusual smell on a person could indicate illness, and in a world governed by miasma theory, illness meant danger. Perfumes, scented oils, and fragrant herbs were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were medical interventions, tools for managing the air around your body, for projecting health and safety. A wealthy woman might carry a sachet of dried lavender, cloves, and rose petals. A merchant might tuck a sprig of rosemary behind his ear. The poor burned juniper branches in their homes or scattered mint on the floor. These were not attempts at seduction or vanity. They were acts of survival, as understood by a world that believes smell itself could kill. You stepped outside into a street that assaulted your senses in ways that are difficult for a modern person to fully imagine. Medieval urban streets were narrow, often no wider than 10 or 12 feet, and they were unpaved, or paved with cobblestones that were uneven, broken, and perpetually slick with organic matter. The central gutter, a shallow channel running down the middle of the street, was the primary drainage system, and into it flowed everything. Kitchen waste, animal dung from the horses, cattle, pigs and chickens that shared the urban space with humans, the contents of chamber pots emptied from upper-story windows with a warning shout of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, which, incidentally, is believed by some etymologists to be the origin of the English word loo. Butchers threw offal and blood into the street. Tanners dumped the chemical waste from their workshops, a foul mixture of animal urine, lime and rotting flesh used to process leather, into the nearest waterway. Dyers released vats of chemical-laden wastewater. The smell on a warm day was dense, layered, and inescapable, a combination of human and animal waste, rotting food, wood smoke, and the sharp, acrid stink of industrial processes that would horrify a modern environmental inspector. And if the streets were filthy, the places where your food was prepared were not much better. Step into a medieval kitchen, whether in a castle, a monastery, or an urban cookshop, and the first thing you notice is the smoke. Cooking was done over open flames, and the ventilation in most kitchens was poor enough that a permanent haze hung in the air, coating every surface with a fine layer of soot and grease. The second thing you notice is the proximity of raw ingredients to finished food, to waste, to the floor, to the flies that clustered on every exposed surface. There was no concept of cross-contamination. The same wooden board used to butcher a chicken that had been walking the courtyard that morning, its feet coated in the same filth that coated the street, was wiped with a cloth and used to chop vegetables. Meat was hung from hooks in the ceiling, exposed to flies, dust, and whatever drifted in through the open windows and doors. Milk was stored in wooden or ceramic vessels that were rinsed between uses but never sterilized, creating a warm, moist environment where bacteria multiplied with abandon. Bread dough was kneaded on tables that were scrubbed but never truly clean, and the flour itself, as we have already noted, contained stone grit from the millstones. The irony is that some medieval cooking practices were accidentally hygienic. Boiling meat in stews and pottages killed many pathogens, as did the heavy use of salt, vinegar, and spices in preservation. But these benefits were entirely accidental, a byproduct of flavor preferences and preservation needs, rather than any understanding of microbial contamination. Cities tried to manage this. They really did. London appointed rakers and scavengers, street cleaners, and imposed fines on citizens who dumped waste in the streets or allowed their pigs to roam freely. Paris had regulations requiring residents to sweep the street in front of their properties. Butchers were ordered to dispose of offal outside the city walls. Tanners and dyers were pushed to the outskirts of towns, downstream from the main population. But enforcement was inconsistent, resources were limited, and the fundamental problem was one of volume. A medieval city of 20 or 30,000 people, packed into a space smaller than a modern shopping mall, with no sewage system, no running water, no garbage collection in any organized sense, and thousands of animals sharing the streets, produced a staggering quantity of organic waste every single day. There was simply nowhere for it all to go. It accumulated, it decomposed, it seeped into the wells that provided the city's drinking water, and it bred the flies, the rats, and the fleas that carried the diseases medieval people could not see, could not understand, and could not escape. The relationship between water and disease was perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval hygiene. Medieval people knew, from hard, repeated, bitter experience that water could make you sick. They observed that people who drank from certain wells fell ill. They noticed that epidemics seemed to cluster in low-lying marshy areas where water collected. But their explanation for this was wrong. They blamed the miasma, the bad air that rose from stagnant water and swampy ground. It never occurred to them that the water itself, contaminated with invisible organisms, was the actual danger. And so their preventive measures, while sensible within their framework, were tragically misdirected. They avoided drinking water, which sometimes helped, since the ale and wine they drank instead had been heated or fermented in ways that killed some pathogens. They burned aromatic herbs and incense to purify the air, which did nothing against waterborne illness but smelled pleasant. They carried pomanders, perforated metal balls filled with spices and fragrant substances, and held them to their noses when passing through foul-smelling areas. During plague outbreaks, the famous beak-like masks worn by plague doctors were stuffed with flowers, herbs, camphor, and vinegar, on the theory that filtering the corrupted air would prevent infection. It did not work. The plague bacillus, Yersinia pestis, traveled not through bad smells, but through flea bites and, in its pneumonic form, through respiratory droplets, mechanisms as invisible to medieval medicine as radio waves would have been. But we have not even gotten to the worst part yet. Let us talk about what happened when you were actually sick, because medieval medical treatment related to hygiene and the body reveals just how far wrong a society can go when its fundamental assumptions are incorrect. If you developed a fever, which could indicate anything from a minor infection to typhus to plague, the standard treatment was bloodletting. A barber surgeon would open a vein in your arm with a lancet, drain blood into a bowl, and declare that this would restore the balance of your humors. If you were already weakened by illness, this actively hastened your death. If you had a wound, a cut from a farming accident, a bite from an animal, a burn from a kitchen fire, the treatment might include packing the wound with a poultice of dung, honey, and herbs, then binding it tightly. The dung introduced bacterial contamination directly into the injury. Wound infections, gangrene, and sepsis were routine outcomes. Surgery was performed without anesthesia beyond a drink of strong wine or a soporific sponge soaked in mandrake and opium, and without any concept of sterilization. The surgeon's instruments, knives, saws, probes, cautery irons, were cleaned with a cloth at best. The hands that touched your open wound had touched dozens of other open wounds before yours. Childbirth was perhaps the single most dangerous hygiene event in a medieval woman's life. The birthing chamber was attended by midwives whose hands had been washed. There was that much awareness. But the concept of sterile conditions was unknown. The straw on the bed was fresh if the family was fortunate. The cloths used to wrap the newborn, the cutting of the umbilical cord was done with a knife or scissors that had been wiped clean but not sterilized, and the stump was treated with a variety of substances, animal fat, powdered herbs, cobwebs, even ashes, that introduced contamination directly into one of the most vulnerable points on the newborn body. Puerperal fever, infection of the birth canal caused by bacteria introduced during delivery, killed staggering numbers of women. The midwife who had just attended a woman dying of such a fever might walk directly to the next birth without changing her clothing or washing more than her hands. The invisible chain of transmission was complete, devastating, and entirely unrecognized. Infant mortality reflected the same ignorance. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday, and many of those deaths were caused by waterborne illnesses, contaminated food, and infections that entered through the umbilical wound or through the practice of pre-chewing food for infants, a common custom that transferred bacteria directly from an adult mouth that might harbor any number of pathogens. The theory of contagion, the idea that disease could spread from one person to another through physical contact or contaminated objects, did exist in rudimentary form. Some medieval physicians, including the Italian Girolamo Fracastoro in 1546, proposed that invisible seeds of disease could be transmitted between people. But these ideas remained marginal, and the dominant miasma theory continued to shape medical practice and public health policy for centuries. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353, which killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, perhaps 25 million people, did more to shape European attitudes toward hygiene than any event before or since, and it did so in ways that were almost entirely counterproductive. The plague arrived in an explosion of death so vast, so sudden, and so inexplicable that it overwhelmed every existing framework for understanding illness. Physicians, clergy, and civic authorities scrambled for explanations and preventive measures. The University of Paris medical faculty, consulted by King Philip VI, concluded that the plague was caused by a conjunction of 3 planets that had corrupted the air. The recommended preventive measures included avoiding bathing, because open pores, it was believed, allowed the corrupted air to enter the body more easily, avoiding physical exertion that caused sweating, and burning aromatic substances to purify the atmosphere. This advice, issued with the full authority of the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, helped create the very conditions that allowed the plague to spread. The fleas that carried Yersinia pestis thrived on unwashed bodies and in unwashed clothing. By telling people to stop bathing, the medical establishment was, with the best of intentions and the most rigorous application of their theoretical framework, actively feeding the epidemic. The post-plague world was, in some ways, dirtier than the one that preceded it. The fear of bathing, the belief that water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease, persisted for centuries. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly boasted that she had bathed only twice in her life, at birth and before her wedding. While this may be exaggeration or legend, it reflects a real cultural shift. The public bathhouses that had been a feature of medieval urban life continued their decline. Private bathing became less frequent among those who could afford it, and virtually non-existent among those who could not. Dry cleaning methods replaced water, rubbing the body with clean linen, brushing the hair, using perfume and powders to mask odor. The emphasis shifted from washing the body to changing the linen that covered it, on the theory that the linen absorbed the impurities and could carry them away without the dangers of water. A clean white shirt became the visible sign of a clean person, regardless of what lay beneath it. And yet, amid all this, there were islands of relative cleanliness that complicate the simple narrative of medieval filth. Monasteries maintained some of the most hygienic environments in medieval Europe. The Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, included specific provisions for washing before meals and for the care of the sick. Many monasteries had sophisticated water systems, lead or clay pipes carrying water from springs or cisterns to kitchens, lavatories, and infirmaries. The lavatorium, a communal washing trough in the cloister, was a standard architectural feature, and monks washed their hands before every meal and were expected to bathe at least several times a year, more frequently during illness. The monastic infirmary was often the cleanest room in medieval Europe, its linens changed regularly, its floors swept, its air freshened with herbs. This was not modern hygiene by any means, but it was dramatically better than the conditions outside the monastery walls. And it is one reason why monastic communities, despite their crowded living conditions, sometimes survived epidemics that devastated the surrounding population. Jewish communities also maintain hygiene practices that set them apart from their Christian neighbors and, tragically, sometimes made them targets of suspicion. Jewish law required regular hand-washing, ritual immersion in the mikveh, and specific practices around food preparation that happened to reduce the risk of contamination. During the Black Death, some contemporary observers noted that Jewish communities appeared to suffer lower mortality rates, a claim that is debated by historians, but that, even as rumor, had devastating consequences. Unable to explain why some populations seemed less affected, Christian mobs accused Jews of poisoning wells, leading to massacres across Central Europe that killed thousands of innocent people. The cruel irony is that if the observation had any basis in reality, it was likely the result of hygiene practices mandated by religious law, practices that the surrounding Christian population could have adopted and that might have saved lives. There is one more dimension of medieval hygiene that deserves attention because it reveals the deepest paradox of all. The medieval church, which historians have sometimes blamed for discouraging bathing and promoting bodily neglect, was simultaneously the institution most responsible for whatever hygiene infrastructure existed. Hospitals, and medieval Europe had hundreds of them, were almost exclusively run by religious orders. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and still operating today, was staffed by Augustinian nuns who washed patients, changed their linens, and provided a level of basic care that was unavailable anywhere else. These hospitals were not medical institutions in the modern sense. They offered shelter, food, clean bedding, and prayer more than they offered treatment. But the simple act of providing a clean bed and regular meals to the sick and destitute saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to exposure, starvation, and neglect. The great irony is that the same theological framework that made some Christians suspicious of bodily pleasure also produced a doctrine of charity that demanded care for the sick, the poor, and the suffering. And that care, however imperfect, was the closest thing to public health that medieval Europe possessed. What does all of this mean when you step back and look at the full picture? Medieval hygiene was not a story of primitive people who did not know any better wallowing in ignorance. It was a story of a sophisticated civilization operating under a set of fundamental scientific errors. Errors about the nature of disease, the role of water, the mechanism of contagion, the relationship between cleanliness and health, that turned their best efforts at staying healthy into instruments of their own destruction. They were not stupid. They were not lazy. They were not indifferent to their own suffering. The medical texts they studied were brilliant in their internal logic. The public health measures they implemented were creative and well-intentioned. The individual practices they followed, washing hands before meals, changing linen, avoiding obviously contaminated water, burning fragrant herbs, were the rational products of a rational system. The system just happened to be wrong. And because it was wrong at the most fundamental level, at the level of what disease actually is and how it actually spreads, no amount of intelligence, effort, or good intention could save them from its consequences. When you step into your shower tomorrow morning and feel clean, hot water cascade over your body, when you reach for soap manufactured to kill 99.9% of bacteria, when you brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste and drink water that has been filtered, chlorinated, and tested for safety, you are not merely enjoying a modern convenience. You are standing at the end of a chain of knowledge that took humanity nearly 2,000 years to assemble, a chain that was forged in catastrophic error, in plagues that depopulated continents, in wrong theories that killed the people they were meant to save. The medieval men and women who held pomanders to their noses as they walked through plague-ravaged streets, who avoided bathing because their doctors told them it would keep them alive, who picked lice from each other's hair with patient, resigned fingers. They were doing the best they could with what they knew. They were, in their own way, as desperate for cleanliness as we are. They simply lived in a world where the very concept of clean, what it meant, how to achieve it, what invisible forces worked for and against it, was built on a foundation of sand. And when that foundation finally crumbled, when Pasteur and Koch and Semmelweis and Snow revealed the invisible world of microorganisms that had been killing people for millennia, it was not just science that changed. It was civilization itself. Every pipe that carries water to your home, every drain that carries waste away, every hospital that requires its staff to wash their hands between patients, all of it is a monument to the lessons learned from centuries of suffering by people who tried to be clean and could not understand why it was never enough. This was not ignorance. It was not negligence. It was the human struggle against an invisible enemy, fought with the wrong weapons, guided by the wrong maps, in a darkness that would not fully lift for another 500 years.